Some men wake up knowing exactly where they are. Callahan Reed wasn't one of them. The last thing he remembered was the searing heat, the taste of his own blood like a copper penny on his tongue, and the grit of sand scouring its way through the worn fabric of his shirt. Now, he was staring up at a woman who stood over him like a monument carved from the very bedrock of the canyon itself. She wasn't offering water. She wasn't offering mercy. She was studying him the way a master artisan studies a block of uncut stone, assessing its flaws and potential, deciding if it was worth the effort to shape into something useful. What Callahan didn't know was that the woman, Nahon, hadn't stumbled upon him by accident. She'd been searching, and what she wanted from him would force him to choose between the man he'd been and the only chance he had left to survive. 3 hours earlier, Callahan had been utterly convinced he was going to die alone. His horse, a skittish bay mare he'd overpaid for in a dusty frontier town, had finally had enough. Spooked by a rattler or her own shadow, she'd bucked him near a dried riverbed, her hooves clipping his shoulder as he fell. The impact had stolen his wind and left him sprawled in the baking sun. By the time he'd dragged his aching body into the thin, desperate shade of a sandstone formation, his canteen was empty, and his vision was starting to fold in on itself, the edges darkening and pulsing with a sickly, yellow light. He'd made it 2 weeks through territory the locals had explicitly refused to travel, their faces grim when he'd outlined his planned route. He'd been convinced, with the unshakable arrogance of a man running from his past, that he could find a shortcut to the mining settlements on the other side of the canyon lands. Arrogance, his father used to say, his voice heavy with disappointment, was just another way of asking the world to teach you a lesson. The lesson had arrived with the subtlety of a hammer blow. It wasn't a storm or a bandit attack. It was the complete and utter silence. No wind whispered through the scrub. No bird circled in the vast, unforgiving blue overhead. There was only the oppressive hammer of the sun on stone and the crawling, primal feeling that something was watching him from the high ridge above. He'd scanned the cliffs until his eyes burned, but saw nothing. The silence itself felt like a presence. Callahan tried to stand twice. The first time his legs, numb and heavy as deadwood, simply buckled, dropping him back to his knees. The second time, he managed a stumbling half-step before the world tilted on its axis and sent him crashing into the sand, the grit grinding into the raw skin of his palms. The third time, he didn't bother trying. The will had drained out of him, leaving only a hollow, weary ache. He closed his eyes against the glare and thought about his sister's face. The way she'd looked at him when he told her he was leaving, her eyes wide with a sorrow that was too deep for tears, like she knew, with a certainty that chilled him even now, that he wouldn't be coming back. When he opened his eyes again, the woman was there. She stood 8 feet away, perfectly still, her shadow falling across his chest like a claim staker's flag. She was taller than any woman he'd ever seen, with a build that suggested she could break a man in half if she decided it was necessary. Her hair, the color of polished jet, fell in 2 thick, intricate braids over her shoulders, and she wore supple leathers decorated with patterns he didn't recognize, etched and dyed into the hide. Necklaces of bone and smooth, colored stone hung from her neck in layered clusters, clicking softly with her every slight, controlled breath. Her eyes, a startling shade of gray, like weathered flint, moved over him slowly, cataloging every detail: the torn shirt, the sunburned skin, the empty holster on his hip, and Callahan felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sensation that had been beaten out of him in back-alley brawls and mining camp disputes. He felt small. She spoke. The language was guttural and rhythmic, rolling out in sounds he couldn't separate into distinct words, but the tone was clear. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an assessment delivered aloud. When he didn't respond, his throat too parched to form a sound, she crouched down, still maintaining that precise distance, and tilted her head. Her gaze was unervingly methodical. It moved from his sun-blistered face to his raw, trembling hands, lingering on the calluses that spoke of a life of hard labor, then down to the hunting knife still strapped securely to his belt. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of the weapon. She stood again in one fluid, powerful motion, and gestured once, a sharp, unambiguous motion toward the east. Callahan tried to speak, but his throat was a desert within a desert. He worked his jaw, his tongue feeling thick and foreign. He managed to rasp out a single cracked word. Water. She didn't move. Her expression didn't flicker. For a long, heart-stopping moment, he thought she was going to leave him there to finish his slow bake in the sun. But then she made another gesture, more insistent this time, a quick, chopping motion with her hand. From behind the surrounding rocks, two figures appeared. Men younger than her, both watching Callahan with expressions of open contempt that made it clear they didn't approve of whatever was happening. One of them, lean and sharp-faced, said something sharp to the woman, his tone challenging. She responded without even looking at him, her voice low, but carrying the kind of authority that didn't require volume to command obedience. The two young men moved forward. They lifted Callahan by his arms, and the world tilted sideways, the canyon spinning in a nauseating whirl of ochre and blue. He tried to keep his eyes open, tried to make sense of the direction they were taking him, but the combined weight of heat and dehydration was a lead blanket, dragging him down into a welcoming darkness. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away completely was the woman walking ahead of them. Her stride was steady and certain, her back straight, like someone who'd already decided how this was going to end, long before he'd ever stumbled into her path. When he woke again, he was lying on woven blankets that smelled of sage and dust, inside a low, dome-shaped structure made of bent branches and stretched hide. The air was cooler, blessedly cooler. Someone had propped his head up and trickled water into his mouth. The memory was hazy, more sensation than event, the blissful coolness seeping down his ravaged throat. Through the gap in the entrance flap, he could see the woman sitting outside, her back straight as a rifle barrel, her hands resting on her knees. She wasn't looking at him, but Callahan had the distinct, unsettling feeling that she knew the exact moment his eyes had opened, that she'd been waiting for it, and that whatever came next wasn't going to be anything like a rescue. Callahan spent the first 2 days drifting in and out of a fevered awareness, his body pulling him under into a deep, healing sleep every time consciousness tried to surface. When he finally managed to stay awake for more than an hour, his mind clearing of its cobwebs, he discovered that staying alive in this place came with unspoken but clearly understood conditions. The two younger men who'd carried him brought food and water, but they did it with the kind of stony silence that made it clear he wasn't a guest. He was a burden. One of them, the lean, sharp-eyed one from the canyon, would set the wooden bowl of stew or the skin of water down just outside of arm's reach, forcing Callahan to crawl the few feet to retrieve it. The message was as obvious as it was brutal. You're here because she allows it, not because we want you here. Nahon appeared twice each day, once at dawn, when the camp was just beginning to stir, and once as the light turned a deep molten amber across the towering canyon walls. She never spoke to him directly during these visits. Instead, she would crouch at the entrance of the shelter, her formidable presence filling the entire space, and simply watch him eat. The first time, Callahan had tried to say something, tried to form the words, "Thank you," his voice a dry croak. But she had held up one hand, palm facing him, stopping him cold. The gesture wasn't harsh, but it was absolute. It was a command. When I am ready for you to speak, I will let you know. On the third day, Callahan was strong enough to sit up without the world tilting and his vision swimming in spots. He took the opportunity to notice details he'd missed before. The camp was small, maybe 15 people in total, but it felt organized with a precision that suggested they'd packed up and moved many times before. The shelters were arranged in a loose circle, each positioned to maximize the scant shade and maintain a clear line of sight to the approaches. Children played quietly near the center, their laughter quick and bright but never loud, while older women worked on tasks he couldn't identify from a distance, their fingers moving deftly over fibers and stones. Everyone moved with a quiet, ingrained purpose. No wasted motion, no idle hands. And everyone watched him. Not openly, not with stares that would meet his own. But Callahan had spent enough time in places where he wasn't wanted, in gambling dens and mining claim offices, to recognize the weight of collective judgment. It was in the way a woman would pause her weaving to glance in his direction, or how a man would stop talking as he walked past the shelter. These people had seen outsiders before. They knew what men like him, men with desperation in their eyes and a past nipping at their heels, brought with them. Trouble at best, violence at worst. The fact that Nahon had chosen to bring him here didn't erase that history. It made them more suspicious, not less. By the fourth day, Callahan could stand, his legs still trembling, but finally able to bear his weight. He made his way outside, testing them like a newborn foal, and found Nahon speaking with 3 older members of the group. They stood in a tight cluster, their voices low but animated. And when one of the men, his face a road map of deep lines, gestured sharply in Callahan's direction, Nahon's response was immediate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Whatever she said, delivered in that same low, authoritative tone, ended the conversation completely. The others dispersed, their expressions unreadable, and she turned to face Callahan with a look that gave away nothing. She walked toward him slowly, closing the distance between them until she stood close enough that he could see the small, silvery scars that crisscrossed her forearms. The kind that came from a lifetime of work that tested skin and bone, from fights and from the simple, harsh act of living in this land. She was taller than him by at least 3 inches. And up close, the sheer physical presence of her was even more striking. This wasn't a woman who'd been chosen to lead because of lineage or luck. She'd earned it by being stronger, smarter, and more relentless than everyone around her. She reached out and placed one hand on his shoulder, her grip firm and unyielding, and spoke a single, guttural word in her language. Then she pointed toward the eastern edge of the camp, where a narrow, rocky path led up into the jumbled, red rocks. The meaning was clear. Walk. Prove you can. Callahan managed 10 minutes before his legs started shaking so violently he had to stop. Nahon walked beside him the entire time, matching his halting pace, her eyes constantly scanning the high ground, never offering help, never speaking a word of encouragement. When he finally stopped, bracing himself against a sun-warmed boulder, his chest heaving, she studied him again with that same dispassionate, appraising look. Then she nodded once, a short, sharp dip of her chin, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. That night, Callahan lay awake on his blankets, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep, the soft murmur of voices, the crackle of a dying fire. Through the gaps in the shelter, he could see Nahon sitting by the central fire pit, her profile outlined in orange light. She wasn't looking at him, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she was thinking about him, calculating, planning. And for the first time since waking up in this strange, silent place, Callahan realized something that made his chest tighten with a fresh wave of dread. She wasn't keeping him alive out of kindness. She was preparing him for something that required him to be strong enough to endure it. And he had no idea what the price of that survival would be. Nahon stood, placing one hand briefly on his shoulder. The gesture felt different now, less like an evaluation of raw material, more like an anchor. A fragile, tentative hope passed from her fingertips into the weary muscle and bone beneath his shirt. "Come," she said, her voice low. "I show you something." He followed her out of the shelter and into the sharp clarity of the morning. His mind was a storm of impossible choices. To stay was to be remade, to become a cornerstone in a structure he barely understood. To leave was to carry the ghost of this place and the silence she promised for the rest of his days. Both paths felt like a surrender of the man he knew, one to duty, the other to regret. At the center of the camp, where the hard-packed earth was worn smooth by generations of feet, the children played. Their game was a simple one, chasing a leather ball stuffed with grass, their laughter ringing high and pure against the immense, indifferent backdrop of the canyon. Nahon stopped, her arms crossed, and watched them. The lines of her face, usually carved from stone, seemed to soften at the edges. "That sound," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Callahan's throat tighten. "It dies with us if you go. No children, no laughter, no future. Just old people waiting to become dust." She turned her head, her flint-gray eyes pinning him in place. You think about that. You decide if their silence is worth your freedom. She walked away, leaving Callahan standing alone, watching the children who might be the last of their kind, listening to the joyful noise that threatened to become the final echo of something beautiful and doomed. He spent the day walking the periphery of the camp, a ghost at the feast of a life he was being offered. Every path his mind took led back to the same impossible junction. To stay was to be forged into a tool for survival, a means to an end. To leave was to be haunted, to always wonder if he had walked away from the only thing that had ever truly. Neither option felt like freedom. One was a cage of obligation, the other a prison of memory. He thought of his sister, Ilara. The way her face had crumpled not in anger, but in profound disappointment, when he told her he was leaving to find something worth doing. He'd spent 3 years since then drifting through mining camps and frontier towns, a specter of failed ventures and empty pockets, looking for purpose in places that had been stripped bare of it. And now, in the most desolate place he'd ever seen, purpose had found him. It stared at him from the eyes of a woman who saw past the drifter and the failure to something she could build a future upon. As the sun bled into the horizon, Callahan found himself near the spring, where clear water welled up in a natural stone basin. Nahon was there alone, kneeling as she filled water skins. She glanced up at his approach, but didn't stop her work. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle splash of water. Callahan sat on a flat rock nearby, watching the way the dying light turned the pool to liquid copper. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, setting the heavy skin aside. "Why didn't you choose one of your own?" he asked. "Someone who already knows your ways? Someone who already speaks your language?" She considered this, her gaze turning inward. "I did choose," she said, the words coming slowly. 3 times. 3 men I thought were strong enough, smart enough. A shadow crossed her features, deep and personal. The first, he was proud, arrogant. Thought being chosen meant he was better than the others. He treated the women like they should be grateful for his attention. I sent him away. She picked up a small stone, turning it over in her fingers. The second, weak inside. Strong body, weak spirit. When the hunting was bad, when the water was low, he blamed others. "He blamed me," said the rot started with my leadership. She looked directly at him, her eyes hard. A man who cannot carry his own weight will crush everyone around him. "And the third?" Callahan prompted softly. Nahon's jaw tightened. "He loved me. Real love. But he could not separate love from duty. Every choice I made, he supported, not because it was right for the people, but because he thought it would please me. Love like that, it is a dangerous thing. It makes you blind when you need sight most." Callahan absorbed this, understanding the unspoken lesson. She didn't need a worshiper, a sycophant, or a rival. She needed a partner. Someone who would look at a hard truth without flinching, who would make choices for the camp, not for her heart. "You don't know me," Callahan said, his voice quiet. "I could be any of those things." "I watched you die," Nahon replied, her voice flat and certain. "And you would not stop fighting. Even when your body had nothing left, your mind kept searching, kept trying. That is not pride. That is not weakness. That is the thing that keeps people alive when everything else has failed." She stood and walked over until she was standing directly before him. Up close, he could see the fine lines webbing the corners of her eyes, the first strands of silver gleaming in her dark braids. She was perhaps 5 years his senior, and every one of those years was etched into the set of her shoulders, the unyielding straightness of her spine. She had carried her people through hardships he could scarcely imagine. "You are afraid," she said. It wasn't a question. "Good. Fear means you understand the weight of the choice. A man with no fear makes stupid choices." Callahan looked up at her, at this woman who had pulled him from the sand for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with cold, hard necessity. "If I stay," he said, his voice rough, "I need to know something. Do you want me here because I'm useful? Or because you see something in me that's worth more than just utility?" Nahon reached out and placed her hand against his chest, over his heart. Her palm was warm and rough, and the pressure was firm, grounding. He felt the steady, accelerated beat of his own heart against her skin. "I see both," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And I need both." She withdrew her hand, the absence of its warmth immediate. "You decide now, because tomorrow the choice becomes permanent." She gathered the water skins and walked back toward the camp, her figure blending into the deepening twilight. Callahan stayed by the spring as the stars pricked the velvet sky, and the desert's nocturnal chill settled around him. He thought of Alara's sorrow, the children's laughter, the feel of Nahon's hand on his chest, not a claim of ownership, but a question. An invitation to choose a version of himself he had never dared to imagine. When he finally stood, his muscles stiff with cold and resolve, he knew what his answer would be. The question that remained was whether he had the courage to speak it into existence. Callahan found Nahon at first light. She stood at the eastern edge of camp, a solitary silhouette against the blazing rim of the canyon, as the sun broke over it. She didn't turn as he approached, but he saw the subtle shift in her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head that acknowledged his presence. He stood beside her, close enough that the sleeve of his worn shirt almost brushed her arm, and waited for the frantic beating of his heart to steady. The words felt too large for his mouth, but he forced them out. "I'll stay," he said, the sound swallowed by the vastness. "I'll do what you're asking." Nahon was quiet for a long moment, her profile stark against the dawn. When she finally turned to look at him, her expression was unreadable, a mask of flint and patience. Then she nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin that seemed to carry the weight of all the trials to come. "Good," she said. "Now the hard part begins." She led him to the center of the camp, where the entire group had gathered, forming a silent, watchful circle. The elder women stood together, their faces etched with solemn curiosity. Tasik, the lean young man, was there, his arms crossed, his expression carefully, forcibly neutral. The children peeked from behind their mother's legs. Nahon stepped into the center of the circle. When she spoke, her voice, though not loud, carried to every ear. Callahan couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the cadence of a formal declaration, a pronouncement that would alter the course of their lives. When she finished, she extended a hand toward him, an unmistakable command to join her. He moved into the center, feeling the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure. Nahon placed her hand on his shoulder, the same spot she had touched before, but this time it was a public branding. He was no longer an outsider. He was a candidate, an investment. The response from the group was a silent, potent mixture. Some of the elder women nodded, a glimmer of approval in their wise eyes. A few of the younger men looked away, their discontent a cold ember in the morning air. The children whispered, their curiosity piqued. Tasik met Callahan's eyes, and the hatred that had once burned there had banked to a simmering, watchful resignation. One of the elder women, the one with a face like a sun-worn map, stepped forward. She spoke directly to Callahan, her tone formal but not unkind. Nahon translated beside him. She says, "You will learn our ways, our language, the skills of this land. You will earn your place here, not just by blood, but by effort. This is the only way the people will accept you." "I understand," Callahan said, directing his words to the elder woman. The woman continued, her gaze piercing. Nahon's translation grew more grave. "You will be taught to track, to read the land, to move without being seen. These things keep us alive. If you cannot learn, you cannot stay." "I'll learn," Callahan vowed. Nahon translated, and the elder woman studied him for a long, assessing moment before giving a single, slow nod of acceptance. As the circle broke up, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The silent tolerance was gone, replaced by a new, demanding expectation. Tasik approached, stopping a few feet away. He looked Callahan up and down, then spoke in halting, broken fragments of his language. "You fight good," Tasik said. "But fight is easy. Living here is hard." He gestured to the camp, the canyon, the vast, unforgiving expanse beyond. "We see if you are strong enough." Before Callahan could form a reply, The young man turned and walked away. It wasn't a threat, not quite. It was a warning, and a challenge laid bare. Nahon touched Callahan's arm. "Come. We start now." She led him to a group of men preparing to leave camp, Tasik among them, checking spears and slinging packs over their shoulders. They were going to hunt, and Callahan was going with them. Tasik looked him over, a flicker of grim amusement in his eyes. "You know how to be quiet?" "I can learn," Callahan replied. "Good," Tasik said, his mouth curving into something that wasn't a smile. "Because if you scare the game, you eat last." He paused, letting the stakes settle. "Maybe you eat nothing." They moved out as the sun climbed, pushing into the canyon lands with a silence that made Callahan's every footfall sound like a landslide. He tried to mimic their fluid, gliding steps, to breathe as they did, shallow and quiet. They didn't mock his clumsiness. They simply moved, their silence a lesson in itself. By midday his legs screamed and his lungs burned, but he kept his place in the line. When Tasik glanced back and saw him still there, still trying, something imperceptible shifted in the set of his shoulders. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was the first grain of respect, earned the only way it could be, through shared hardship and silent endurance. And back in the camp, Nahon stood watching the horizon, her face a mask of calm, waiting to see if the man she had pulled from the jaws of death would survive his first, true test. And the children, those beautiful, loud children whose laughter Nahon had held up as the very sound of a future, crowded around with wide-eyed questions and unbridled excitement. Their joy was a tangible thing, a force that seemed to push back against the harshness of the land. But it was not just Nahon. In the months that followed, two of the other women of age, Liana and Sela, had also accepted Callahan's role in the rebirth of their people. The arrangements were practical, born of necessity and a shared, solemn purpose, but they were conducted with a growing respect. Within the year, they too would bear children. The bloodline Nahon had fought so desperately to preserve was no longer withering on the vine. It was being reborn, its ancient roots strengthened and given new life by the infusion of resilient, foreign stock. That night, as Callahan lay beside Nahon in the shelter they now shared, she found his hand in the darkness and guided it to her belly, where the first, firm curve of their child was beginning to show beneath her skin. "You gave up everything to be here," she said, her voice a quiet murmur in the dark. "Your old life, your old name, everything you were." Callahan thought of the man he had been, the drifter dying in the desert, sun-blinded and lost, convinced his life would never amount to more than a series of failures and escapes. That man felt like a ghost, a faded photograph. He had been transformed, his edges worn smooth and his core hardened, reforged into someone who belonged to this land, to these people, to this woman. "I didn't give up anything," he said, his voice thick with a certainty that went deeper than bone. He pulled her closer, the warmth of her body a familiar comfort. "I finally found what I was looking for." Nahon shifted against him, her breath warm against his neck. "And what was that?" "A reason," Callahan said, the simplicity of the answer holding the weight of his entire world. "A reason to be more than I was." Outside, the desert wind moved through the canyon, an eternal breath that carried the sounds of the camp settling into a peaceful sleep. The bright, clear voices of children, their laughter lingering in the cooling air. The low, rhythmic murmur of elders sharing stories by the dying fire. The steady, purposeful rhythm of a people who would not disappear, who would now continue, generation after generation. Because one woman had been brave enough to choose survival over tradition, and one man had been brave enough to choose purpose over fear. The new bloodline had begun, and with it, the future Nahon had fought for, bled for, and gambled everything on, was no longer a hope or a plan. It was finally, definitively real.